Hi guys, I'm going to talk a film called Not of This Earth, which was produced in the United States in 1957 and directed by Roger Corman, the famous director of independent films. It talks about someone named Mr. Johnson, who was actually not of this planet, and he came to planet Earth because in his planet, because of a nuclear war, people were suffering from an incurable blood disease, and he was on Earth to check if the human blood would be useful to cure this disease of the population of his planet. So he took the name of Mr. Johnson. He lived in a house. He hired an employee to help him with the housework and led an apparently normal life. In the beginning of the film, we can see him going to the doctor, and he wanted a blood transfusion immediately, saying that he was dying, but he refused to have his blood tested. And of course, both the doctor and the nurse didn't want to make a blood transfusion before checking his blood. And Mr. Johnson insisted. The doctor was adamant. He said no. So then Mr. Johnson used his telepathic powers to hypnotize the doctor. Because Mr. Johnson, he could communicate with people through telepathy, and his eyes were different from the eyes of people from the Earth. And he had a kind of powerful eyesight. He had a kind of powerful eyes with power to burn the brain of a person. So he hypnotized the doctor to treat him, but never tell to anyone else about his condition. Also, Mr. Johnson, when he was leaving the doctor's office, he asked the nurse if she would work for him as his private nurse in his house. Of course, that it's a weird offer, but he offered lots of money to the nurse as payment, and she accepted. And she worked at Mr. Johnson's house, and she also lived there. And her name was Nadine. At first, Nadine didn't realize the situation she was. She found Mr. Johnson was a very nice employer. She was happy with her work, with her treatment. But then she started talking with the employee of the house. And the employee told her that people who entered the house never got out of the house, because Mr. Johnson needed constant blood transfusions, but there was a limit to the amount of blood transfusion he could get. So he went to the street and drained blood directly from people. So he drained blood from a teenager who was returning home after a date. He drained blood from 3 people who were homeless. He drained blood from random people on the street. Often they invited those people to his house, and of course they didn't return because they were murdered there. And one of Mr. Johnson's victims was a vacuum cleaner seller. At first, Mr. Johnson didn't want to buy any vacuum cleaner, didn't want to see anything. But the salesman insisted a lot, and then Mr. Johnson had the idea of draining his blood too. So, as time passed, Nadine started to grow suspicious. And at the same time, she had a close friend, and he was a policeman. And the policeman, of course, started being suspicious before Nadine. And then both Nadine and her policeman friend talked to the doctor who was treating Mr. Johnson. But as the doctor was still hypnotized by Mr. Johnson, he didn't say anything at all. because his mind was completely dominated by Mr. Johnson's telepathic powers. However, Mr. Johnson had two suspicious traits. He was always wearing sunglasses because his eyes were totally different from the eyes of human beings from the earth, and his ears were very sensitive to loud noises. Then Nadine started to be very suspicious. She realized that Mr. Johnson was an alien and she wanted to run away. But Mr. Johnson found it out and started chasing Nadine. At first, she got to get rid of him because she started yelling, and the noise of her screams, it hurt Mr. Johnson's ears. So she went to a forest. Mr. Johnson was still chasing her, and he was saying that he wouldn't kill her, that she would actually be sent to his planet as a living human sample to his people, which is not of any comfort after all. And then, when it seemed that Nadine would be caught by Mr. Johnson, her policeman friend, with other policemen who worked with him, they appeared in the scene to try to save Nadine. However, we must remember that Mr. Johnson was sensitive to loud noises. So the police car siren, it hurt his ears and he lost energy. And then, after a while, Mr. Johnson passed away because he needed blood immediately and he couldn't find a supply of blood. And then the disease took him. The disease dominated him. And before he died, and before everyone else in the film was suspicious of him, there was another woman who was from his original planet, which was called Planet Davana. So another woman from Planet Davana, she met Mr. Johnson and told him that she was extremely sick and that she needed immediate blood transfusion. And Mr. Johnson took her to the hospital and gave her blood. However, it was the blood of a dog who had rabies. And of course that this woman passed away because she underwent a blood transfusion with contaminated blood. So, of course, she died. And then she died in the middle of the street, and it made people even more suspicious of Mr. Johnson. Then the film ends with both Nadine and her policeman friend in a cemetery, seeing Mr. Johnson's in the cemetery, and the policeman was a little bit sorry for him because after all, he came to Earth to find a cure to his people, while Nadine wasn't sorry for him at all. And it's good because the audiences are offered two opinions, if Mr. Johnson was worthy of pity or not. And while they were in the cemetery, then it appeared another man who looked just like Mr. Johnson, with the same outfit, same sunglasses, approaching the couple. And then the film ends. So we don't know if it's someone else from Planet Davana or if somehow Mr. Johnson survived. We don't know, but it's an open end, very interesting. And those independent and B films from the 1950s and 1960s, they were really interesting because the actors and directors got to make the most of everything, even though they didn't have many resources. So it's very entertaining for nowadays audiences, and those films are usually very short, so you can watch them quickly. So yes, I recommend this one. I think you're going to like this and be entertained. That's all for now. See you!